$500. That's your share of your father's estate. My uncle held out an envelope while I was still standing in the hospital atrium in my white uniform, my new RN pin just fastened to my chest. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. I always love seeing how far these stories reach, and if you're new here, please subscribe, because what my uncle said that afternoon was only the first crack in something I never knew was broken. My name is Lacey, and for 6 years I had been telling myself that struggling was just part of the journey. I started nursing school at 22 with a full heart and an empty savings account. My father had died 2 years before I enrolled, a heart attack, sudden, no warning, and he left behind a house, a small business, and a family that didn't know how to hold itself together without him. I was 20, still in community college, still figuring out who I was when the phone call came. After the funeral, my Uncle Gordon stepped in. He was my father's older brother, the one who always talked about responsibility and family legacy at holiday dinners. He said he would handle my father's estate. He said everything would be managed properly. He said I didn't need to worry. I believed him. That was my first mistake. I spent the next 6 years working 2 jobs while I completed my prerequisites, got into nursing school, and somehow made it through. I worked as a home health aide during the week and waitressed on weekends. There were semesters when I studied from midnight to 4 in the morning and still opened the diner by 6. I applied for every scholarship I could find. I ate cereal for dinner 3 nights a week and told myself it was temporary. Whenever I brought up my father's estate, my uncle had the same answer every time. The estate is complicated, he'd say. Your father had debts, there are legal fees. I'm handling it the best I can. Once, I asked him directly if there was any money left for me. He sighed like I had said something embarrassing and told me I should focus on my studies instead of worrying about things I didn't understand. I stopped asking. I told myself he was grieving too. I told myself he was doing his best. I told myself that when I finally became a nurse, when I passed my boards, when I had a real career, maybe then he would look at me and see someone worth taking seriously. The pinning ceremony was held on a Thursday evening in the hospital's main atrium. It's a nursing tradition, the moment a new nurse receives their first pin from someone who matters to them, signifying the beginning of their career. My Aunt Estelle, my father's older sister, had driven 3 hours from Raleigh to be there. She was wearing her church hat and her good pearls, and when she pressed that small silver pin against my chest, she whispered, "Your daddy would have been so proud of you, baby." My father's memory lived mostly in other people's words. I didn't have enough of my own. He died when I was 20, before I had built enough adult memories with him. What I had were fragments. His laugh, the way he called me Lace with that drawn-out vowel, the coffee smell of his Saturday mornings, and a photograph on my aunt's fireplace mantel of the 2 of us at my high school graduation, him grinning like he had just won something important. My aunt had always told me, "Your father wanted more for you than you can imagine." I used to think that was just something people said when they were trying to be kind. I never pressed her on it. The atrium was packed that evening. Other nurses' families had come. Mothers with cameras, partners holding bouquets, children running between the rows of chairs. My classmates were laughing and taking pictures before the ceremony had even officially ended. The room was warm and loud and full, in the way celebrations are when everyone feels like they deserve to be there. My Uncle Gordon had come with his wife Miriam and their son Damon, who was around my age. I had spent most of my childhood around Damon at family gatherings, though we had never been close. He was quieter than me, careful in the way people are when they've learned to stay out of the way. I didn't think much about it that night. I was too focused on getting through the ceremony without crying in front of my supervisor. After the pinning, I found my family near the back of the atrium. My aunt hugged me again. Miriam said congratulations and went back to her phone. Damon gave me a stiff half hug and said good job without quite looking at me. And my Uncle Gordon stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, nodding slowly. The way people nod when they're waiting for a conversation to be over. Then he reached into his inside pocket. I thought he was reaching for his phone. Instead, he pulled out a white envelope and held it out to me. "Your father's estate," he said. "What's left for you?" I took it. I looked at him first, then at the envelope, then I opened it. Inside was a personal check made out to my name, $500. I stared at it for a long moment. The noise of the atrium kept going around me, but I felt it pull back, like someone had turned down a dial. $500. For a 6-year-old estate that had included a paid-off house and a small business my father had spent 20 years building. Uncle Gordon, I said, keeping my voice low, this can't be right. He shrugged, actually shrugged, one shoulder, like I had asked him whether he wanted mustard on his sandwich. Estate had a lot of costs. Legal fees, back taxes on the property. It took years to settle everything properly. I never saw any of the paperwork, I said. You didn't need to. He looked at me then, really looked, with that particular expression I remembered from every conversation we'd ever had about money, flat, a little impatient, like I was asking a question I had no right to ask. I managed this for years, kept the family together. $500 is what's left, and it's more than most people walk away with. A few of my classmates were nearby. My supervisor was passing the group of physicians. 2 of the nursing instructors who had passed me through my final clinical were standing 6 feet away. And my uncle was saying this loudly enough for anyone nearby to hear, that my father's estate had come down to $500 and I should consider myself fortunate. I looked at the check in my hand. The number felt wrong in a way I couldn't yet explain. Something about the way he said it, practiced, rehearsed, made my stomach tighten. My Aunt Estelle stepped forward. Gordon. Her voice was quiet but her jaw was set. He glanced at her. What? She didn't answer him. She looked at me instead, and there was something in her expression I had never seen from her before. It wasn't pity. It was recognition. Like she had just remembered something she had been pushing aside for a long time, and it had come back with full force. I looked at Damon. For just a second, our eyes met. He looked away immediately, the way you look away from something you don't want to be part of. That quick, deliberate turning away stayed with me longer than anything else from that evening. My aunt stepped close and took my hand in both of hers. Lacey, she said, don't say anything right now. I'm not going to make a scene, I told her quietly. She squeezed my hand. That's not what I mean. She dropped her voice lower. I need to talk to you. Not here. Not tonight. Come see me this weekend. Drive up to Raleigh. Don't mention it to your uncle. Come alone. My uncle was already moving toward the exit, Miriam at his side. He called back. Estelle, you coming? We're going to beat the traffic. My aunt looked at him, then back at me. She pressed my hand once more, hard and deliberate, and let go. I watched her walk toward the exit, turning over the way she had said come alone. Not casually, like a warning she couldn't say out loud. I drove home that night, with the check on the passenger seat, and a feeling I couldn't name sitting in my chest. I kept thinking about 6 years of cereal dinners and 4 in-the-morning study sessions. I kept thinking about every time I had asked my uncle about my father's estate, and he had looked at me like I was asking something naive. Maybe I had been naive, but I was starting to think I had been made that way on purpose. That Saturday, I drove to Raleigh. My aunt was at the door when I pulled in. She didn't fuss over whether I'd eaten. She didn't turn on the television. She walked me straight to the kitchen table, put a cup of coffee in front of me that neither of us touched, and sat down with her hands folded. I have to tell you something, she said. And I need you to hear all of it before you say anything. I nodded. She got up and went to the hall closet. From the back of the top shelf, behind a stack of folded blankets, she brought out a fireproof document box with a small lock on the front. She set it on the table between us. Your father gave me this about 6 months before he died, she said. His health wasn't good, and he said he wanted someone else to hold on to these. He asked me not to tell Gordon. My throat tightened. Why not tell Uncle Gordon? She paused. Because your father loved his brother, but didn't fully trust him, not with this. She opened the box. Inside were documents with yellowed edges that smelled faintly of cedar. She laid them in front of me. The first was a copy of my father's will, dated 4 years before his death. I had never seen it. The second was a letter in my father's handwriting, addressed to me. The third was a document from an attorney's office, the terms of the estate and my father's wishes for distribution. She pointed to a paragraph in the will. I leaned forward and read. My father had been specific. The proceeds from the sale of his house, which had been paid off, along with the business assets, were to be managed and then distributed to me when I turned 25. The house alone had been appraised at a number that made my hands go cold when I read it. What happened to all of it? I asked, already knowing the shape of what was coming. My aunt looked down at the table. Gordon became the executor. He told everyone the estate was complicated, debts, fees. I believed him. I thought he was doing what your father wanted. She looked up. But last year, a woman from the neighborhood mentioned she'd heard Gordon sold your father's house back in 2019. When I asked him about it, he got very defensive. That's when I knew something wasn't right. I sat back in my chair. I thought about the years. I thought about the scholarships I had scraped together, and the late shifts I had taken when I was already exhausted. I thought about calculating whether I could afford a parking permit for the spring semester. And I thought about my father's house on the south side of Charlotte, the one he had paid off before I was 10, being sold by someone else while I was eating cereal to save money. He sold the house, I said out loud. My aunt nodded. Where did the money go? She shook her head slowly. That's what you need to find out. I drove home with copies of everything in a folder on my passenger seat, right where the check had been the weekend before. When I got back to my apartment, I pulled out a shoebox from the closet, the one where I kept things I didn't know what to do with. Old financial aid letters, a scholarship rejection, a birthday card from my aunt for my 25th birthday that said, "Your father always said you were going to do something that mattered. He was right. Love always, Aunt Estelle." I had thought that card was about nursing. Now I wasn't sure what it was about. I called my friend Reese the next morning. Reese works in accounting and had helped me sort out a tax issue the year before. Detail-oriented, calm, the kind of person who doesn't panic when numbers don't add up, just starts looking for where the error is. I brought everything to Reese's apartment: the will, the attorney's letter, my financial aid records, the $500 check. We spread it across the coffee table. Your father's estate had fiduciary obligations, Reese said after working through the pages. If Gordon was the executor, he had a legal duty to distribute according to the will. If the house was sold, those proceeds had to either pay legitimate documented estate debts, or go to you. We need the actual probate records. Reese paused. Probate filings in North Carolina are public record. You can formally request them. I filed the request that week. While I waited, I drove to my uncle's house. I hadn't told Reese. I knew Reese would have told me to wait. My uncle was in the garage when I arrived, working at the workbench. He looked up and his expression didn't change. Not warm, not cold, just neutral in the careful way of someone who has practiced it. We talked about nothing for a few minutes. The weather, my new job at the hospital, whether I'd settled into my apartment. Then I said, as casually as I could manage, I've been going through some of Dad's old paperwork. Aunt Estelle had some documents he left with her. His hands stopped moving on the workbench, just for a second. What kind of documents? He asked. Old stuff, some estate paperwork. Those are official records, he said, and something had shifted in his voice, harder, slightly elevated. You should have come to me directly if you had questions. I didn't know there were questions to ask, I said. Miriam appeared in the doorway from the kitchen. She had clearly been listening. Lacey, your uncle spent years taking care of your father's affairs. That was an enormous amount of work. The least you could do is appreciate what he went through instead of going behind his back. I looked at her. I looked at my uncle. Neither held my eyes for more than a moment. I'm not trying to cause problems, I said. I just want to understand what happened. My uncle set down what he was holding and crossed his arms. The estate is closed. It's done. Let it go. I picked up my bag and left. I sat in my car before starting the engine, just breathing. I hadn't gotten any answers, but I had gotten something more useful. Confirmation that there was something he needed me not to find. My Aunt Estelle gave me the name of an attorney in Charlotte. Her name was Carol Webb, and she specialized in estate disputes and probate law. I brought every document I had. Carol went through them carefully, asked pointed questions, took notes in the way of someone who had seen this before. If the will clearly designated you as the primary beneficiary, Carol said, and the executor sold estate assets without properly distributing the proceeds to you, that's a breach of fiduciary duty. We need the actual estate records to establish what came in and what went out. I've already requested the probate filings, I told her. She nodded. Don't confront your uncle again. Let the documents speak. The records arrived 10 days later. Carol called me to her office before opening them. The file was thick. She placed it on her desk and pushed it toward me, and I understood from the careful way she did it that this wasn't going to be easy. The first page showed the total appraised value of my father's estate at the time of probate. The number was far more than $500, far more than I had allowed myself to imagine. The house alone had been appraised at a figure that made my hands go cold. Then I saw the transaction records. The house had been sold, The proceeds had gone into the estate account. And then year after year, they had gone back out. Mortgage payments on a property that had never belonged to my father. A family vacation to Aruba. 4 years of private college tuition for Damon. A home renovation. A truck. I turned page after page. Carol sat quietly and let me read. When I looked up, my eyes were blurring. How much is left? I asked. The amount sent to you, Carol said. The $500. I thought about every scholarship application. The home health aid shifts I had taken, on days I was already running on no sleep. The years, 6 of them, spent believing there was no money, that I was starting from zero, that the struggling was just the price of the life I wanted. And I thought about Damon. His name was on those pages, his tuition. His future had been built, at least in part, on money my father had left for mine. I wasn't angry at him. Not then. I was just devastated by what it meant. I showed my Aunt Estelle the records that weekend. She read through them slowly, stopping at the pages that were hardest. When she reached Damon's tuition records, she set the papers down and pressed her hand over her mouth. I should have pushed harder, she said. I should have asked more questions years ago. I shook my head. You trusted him. He was your father's executor. She looked at me through tears. He was supposed to protect what your father built for you. I reached across and held her hand. We sat like that for a while without speaking. Carol had given me a choice, a quiet demand letter and a private settlement, or a full legal reckoning. I told her I wasn't interested in quiet. But I also didn't want lawyers to be the ones to tell my family what had happened. My father deserved more than a settlement notice. And I deserved to look my uncle in the eye and say it myself, in front of everyone who had been told there was nothing left. I asked my aunt if she would host a family dinner. She understood without me having to explain the rest of it. She called my uncle and said it was a proper celebration for my nursing pin, that the ceremony had been rushed and she wanted to do something right. He accepted. Miriam confirmed they'd come. Damon said he'd be there. That week, Reese helped me organize the records by year and label every relevant transaction. We made clean copies of everything. I wasn't going to summarize or characterize. I was going to put the actual numbers on the table and let them speak. The night before the dinner, I stood in my aunt's kitchen helping set the table. She watched me fold napkins with a look on her face I couldn't quite read. Are you sure? She asked. I thought about it honestly. No, I said, but I've been afraid of this conversation for a long time. I'm done being afraid of it. She touched my shoulder briefly and went back to the stove. The $500 check was still in my wallet, uncashed. I had been carrying it for weeks without fully knowing why. That night I understood. I wasn't done with it yet. The following evening, everyone sat around my aunt's dining room table. My uncle was relaxed, talking about something he had seen on television, commenting on the food. Miriam was pleasant in the careful way she always managed at family gatherings. Damon ate without saying much. My aunt kept her eyes on me, waiting. I waited until after the main course. Then I stood up and placed the first folder on the table. Uncle Gordon, I said, there are some things we need to talk about. His expression shifted immediately. He recognized the folder, or at least recognized that something was happening that he had not arranged. I opened it and began laying the pages out one by one. These are the probate records from my father's estate, I said. The ones I requested through the county clerk's office. I pointed to the first transaction. This was a mortgage payment on your house paid from the estate account 6 months after my father's property was sold. I moved to the next page. This was a trip to Aruba. The next. These are 4 years of Damon's college tuition, paid from the same account. Nobody spoke. Miriam's face had drained of color. She was looking at my uncle. He pushed back from the table slightly. You have no idea what it cost to manage that estate for years. Legal fees, taxes. It was a full-time responsibility. The legal fees are documented in the same records, I said. They don't account for the rest of it. You were a child, he said, and his voice had gone hard. Someone had to make decisions. I kept the family functioning. I gave up years of my life. My father wrote down what he wanted done with his estate, I said. I didn't raise my voice. He put it in a legal document. He named me as the beneficiary. And while I was working double shifts and eating whatever was cheapest, and filing scholarship applications at midnight, this money was being used for things that had nothing to do with me. Damon had gone completely still across the table. He was staring at the pages I had laid out, reading the numbers. I watched his face change as he understood what he was looking at. Dad, his voice was very careful, is this real? My uncle turned toward him. Damon. My college tuition is in here. Damon looked up from the pages. He looked at me directly for the first time that evening. Lacey, I didn't know. Those 3 words. I had been bracing for that moment, without realizing it, for weeks. And when it came, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like grief, for what should have been different from the very beginning, for a version of events where none of this had needed to happen. I know you didn't, I told him, and I meant it completely. My uncle stood up. He said we were conspiring against him. He said I had always been ungrateful. He said everything he had done was for the good of the family. He said it loudly enough for the whole room to hear, and then he walked out of my aunt's front door. It closed hard behind him. Nobody moved. My aunt reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Neither of us said anything for a long time. The legal process took several months. My uncle's attorney, once presented with the full probate record, advised him to settle rather than go to trial. He had no real defense. The fiduciary breach was documented clearly. The transactions were on record, and a trial would have made everything public in a way a settlement could avoid. He agreed to repay a significant portion of what could be recovered, secured through a lien on his property. It wasn't everything. It couldn't give back 6 years of double shifts, or the grad program I had put off, or the nights I had lain awake calculating whether I could afford to stay enrolled. But the truth was now officially acknowledged. That mattered to me more than I expected it to. My Aunt Estelle called me one evening about a month after the settlement and asked me to come to Raleigh. When I sat down at her kitchen table, she slid a legal document across to me. She had updated her own will to leave me her house. "This isn't about what Gordon took from you," she said before I could speak. "This is from me. Your father asked me to hold on to things for you, and I held on to the wrong ones for too long." She looked at me steadily. "I want you to always have somewhere to land." I couldn't find words for a moment. I looked at the document and thought about my father, who had trusted his sister with his papers, because he wasn't sure his brother could be trusted, and who had died before he could make sure any of it worked the way he intended. With part of the settlement, I enrolled in a graduate nursing program, the one I had been looking at for 2 years and telling myself I couldn't afford. This time I could. I wasn't calculating parking permits. I wasn't picking up extra shifts to stay afloat. I was just going. Damon reached out a few weeks after the dinner. We talked longer than we ever had in our lives. He didn't try to explain or justify what his father had done. He just said he was sorry, and that he was going to figure out how to make it right in whatever way he could. I told him I wasn't going to tell him what that looked like. That was his to decide. I kept the $500 check. I had it framed, the original uncashed, in a simple black frame, and I hung it above my desk in the small home office I set up when I started grad school. Not because $500 meant anything to me on its own, but because of what it had opened. My uncle had handed me that check in the atrium where I had just become a nurse, in front of my coworkers and supervisors, and everyone who had just watched me pin on that badge, and he had said, "That's your share, that's all that's left." He had been wrong about my father's wishes, wrong about his obligations, and wrong about what 6 years of my life had been worth. But most of all, he had been wrong about what I deserved. My father knew better. He wrote it down, signed it, and handed a copy to his sister for safekeeping. My worth was never in an account my uncle could drain or an estate he could mismanage. It was in the pin on my chest, and the 6 years I had built something real, without knowing I had every right to ask for more. It was in the letter my father had written, when he wasn't sure how much time he had. The letter that had been waiting for me in a fireproof box, on a high shelf in Raleigh for years. That letter sits on my desk now, beside the framed check. Before you go, I want to ask you something. If you found out that someone had taken what was meant for you, would you expose it publicly, pursue it quietly through the courts, or walk away and let it go? Leave your answer in the comments. Subscribe if you want to hear the next story. And wherever you're watching from today, thank you for being here.